Often, a collapse of faith isn't marked by a grand, dramatic event. Instead, it creeps in quietly. A subtle fatigue that settles deep within your bones, resistant to rest, and untouched by quick fixes. You continue through your days, maintaining your beliefs, showing up where expected, but inside, something feels slightly off balance. Acknowledging this feels risky, as if you might be ungrateful or overreacting to nothing significant. Here's a hard truth most never voice, some of the deepest spiritual realignments don't begin with bursts of passion or sudden clarity. They start with a persistent unease that won't let go, with familiar routines that lose their meaning, with a life that still functions yet no longer feels like home. Scripture doesn't rush to dismiss this feeling. Many assume that any inner unrest signals a failure or a wrong turn. But what if this tension is actually the quiet sign that something profound is being reshaped within you? What if the stillness, the heaviness, the nameless shift isn't your enemy at all? This weariness, which feels like an ending, might in reality be a beginning. Let me be honest from the start. This phase is hard to talk about because it lacks impressive, outward signs. Life moves on without pause. Responsibilities call. You get up, handle your tasks, respond to others, carry your burdens. Yet underneath all that is a hush, a quiet weight, heavier than any noise. It's not sorrow exactly, not a breakdown you can name, but rather a constant, low-level tiredness that won't lift, no matter what you try. Scripture offers many glimpses, showing that true inner transformation rarely explodes onto the scene. Instead, it arrives in quiet moments, a season where prayers become briefer, assurance thins, and confidence feels distant. The texts don't always explain why these times happen. They simply reveal people moving through them, persisting, breathing, questioning. This ambiguity is uncomfortable because we crave clear definitions. We want neat labels for what we're experiencing. Stillness, however, refuses to provide them. When we look at the women whose stories are woven throughout the Bible, especially in their ancient contexts, this stillness carried heavy costs. Their identities, security, and futures often depended on roles beyond their control. So, when circumstances remained stuck and answers stayed silent, the waiting was not inspiring but exhausting. It bore down on both body and spirit. Scripture does not gloss over this. It leaves the tension unresolved, as if to affirm that this difficult chapter holds its own important value. Let's consider a thought that might feel unsettling. Sometimes, the silence we encounter in life isn't about discipline, absence, or defeat. Some insights suggest that this silence serves as a narrowing, a gentle clearing, away of what no longer benefits us. This isn't because the life we led before was wrong. Rather, new growth requires open, uncluttered space to thrive. Yet, while we're immersed in this stillness, even this hopeful perspective can feel hollow. Stillness rarely seems deliberate. Instead, it can feel confusing, even unfair. In my experience during these quiet seasons, people often become their own harshest critics. They think I should be more consistent, or I ought to feel more alive. However, the biblical narrative doesn't always celebrate strength right from the start. Instead, it honors raw honesty, weariness, and those long stretches when expectations don't align with reality. True growth often happens beneath the surface, in places unseen and uncelebrated, even by the one who is changing. So, let me ask you this. Take your time before answering. When your inner world grows this still, do you see it as a flaw that needs fixing? Pay closer attention, because often, the next chapter in your life story begins the moment you stop trying to outrun the quiet. Now, let's talk about waiting, especially when it feels like a permanent weight. Being honest with you, waiting seems noble when we look back on it. But in the midst of it, it just feels heavy and exhausting. Hours drag on. Patterns repeat endlessly. And gradually, almost without noticing, waiting stops being temporary and starts shaping how you will view yourself. Scripture revisits the strain again and again, never smoothing it over. It lets waiting be awkward, unfinished, even humiliating at times. A pattern emerges throughout these biblical stories. Before any visible progress, there's often a long season where we repeat faithful actions without clear results, praying, showing up, enduring. Some texts suggest this isn't just about how long you can hold on. It's about reshaping what you truly desire. Waiting reveals what we believe can be quickly fixed and exposes the fears about what might never change. Many women in biblical narratives faced waiting that was anything but idle. Their waiting was active, draining, and very public. Their unanswered desires were noticed by others. Their silence attracted attention. In those ancient cultures, delays often spark judgment rather than empathy. You can almost hear the whispers, "What did you do to deserve this?" That scrutiny challenged more than their faith. It shook their sense of identity. This is where the discomfort deepens. Belief during these long waits often seems less sturdy, not stronger. Prayers become simpler, more raw, unpolished, unfiltered. The texts record moments when these women don't sound confident. They sound worn out, discouraged, still loyal, but far from perfect. And intriguingly, the text doesn't scold them for this lack of polish. It simply preserves their honest words. Let's be honest, this is often the moment when comparison sneaks in unnoticed. You see someone else's prayer answered, their breakthrough achieved, their joy shining brightly while your own weight feels louder, more palpable. The Bible doesn't shy away from this contrast. It purposefully places stories side by side to remind us that a delay doesn't mean rejection, even if it feels painfully that way. Take a moment to consider this. What if waiting isn't primarily about building endurance, but about helping you become more truthful with yourself? What if faith quiets ahead of gaining clarity? This idea unsettles us because we crave visible progress, yet Scripture frequently values inner peace over outward success. Now, here's a question I want to answer for you right now. When your waiting drags on beyond what you expected, which inner voice becomes the loudest? Trust, anxiety, or just sheer exhaustion? That inner voice shapes the next chapter in ways we often underestimate. Then comes a subtle, yet profound shift. The instant you realize the old version of yourself no longer fits. This change is nearly invisible at first. Your daily routine remains the same, but inside, something clicks into place or perhaps cracks open. Suddenly, the strategies and coping mechanisms that once helped you don't suffice anymore. It's not because they were wrong, but because they've grown too small for who you are becoming. This newfound awareness can feel deeply disorienting. Biblical narratives often pause right before any visible action begins, lingering on these internal turning points. The text slows down here intentionally, signaling their significance. Thoughtful readers note that Scripture highlights these private awakenings because once awareness dawns, returning to unknowing is impossible. And yes, that can be scary. For many women in these ancient stories, awareness arrives hand in hand with a sense of separation. They remain part of their family and community, but no longer fit the roles expected of them. In their culture, changing without approval could be dangerous. You can feel the tension. Moving forward risks connection. Staying authentic risks isolation. The Bible doesn't rush past this struggle. Here's an often overlooked truth. Inner awakening seldom feels sacred at first. It can come with restlessness, impatience with what you once accepted without question. Even your prayers change, becoming less structured, more urgent, as if your spirit can no longer pretend. Scripture doesn't judge this phase. It records it with honesty. Often, when people sense an inner shift, their first instinct is to retreat, yearning to recapture the earlier sense of comfort. Yet, the deeper story reveals that once a certain threshold is crossed, trying to step backward only tightens the inner pressure. Growth that has begun demands honesty, and honesty always comes with a cost. Certainty falters. Approval wanes. Ease dissolves. This phase calls for a gentle kind of bravery, not the boisterous, outward kind, but the quiet resilience that keeps returning, even when you lack the words to describe the changes unfolding within. Some perspectives suggest this is the moment when true belief ripens, not by accumulating more answers, but by steadfastly refusing to deceive yourself any longer. So pause here with this question, and don't rush past it. When you first noticed something inside shifting, did you dismiss it, or did you stay with that discomfort, even though it complicated everything? Because once that realization takes root, the narrative can no longer remain entirely silent or private. That inner change begins to manifest outwardly. I say this carefully because here is where tension begins to tighten. Until now, everything has remained internal, quiet, contained. But inevitably, this internal shift surfaces in subtle, almost accidental ways, not through grand announcements, but through small decisions, through the things you no longer find funny, through the subjects you can no longer keep quiet about. And it's here that complications arise. In many biblical stories, this marks the moment when personal belief ceases to be a private matter and becomes a visible tension. Not because the individual seeks notice, but because sincere alignment eventually reveals itself. In these historical contexts, stepping outside expected norms wasn't just unconventional. It carried risks to security, reputation, and community ties. Scripture never glosses over this reality. What is striking is how understated these moments are in the text. No soaring drama, no heroic spotlight, just everyday choices that quietly confront the status quo. A soft refusal, a deliberate pause, a response that diverges from what others anticipate. The Bible often lets these moments slip by without grandeur, perhaps reflecting how true courage usually shows itself. Steady and often misunderstood. This is also where belief can start feeling isolating. Not because the divine presence withdraws, but because others may fail to perceive the change. You remain the same person outwardly, yet inside, you've shifted. Conversations take on a slightly different tension. Expectations don't fit as they once did. There's a pull to over-explain, to justify, to smooth things over. But Scripture suggests that not every transition can be explained ahead of time. Let's face a hard reality. True obedience often disrupts our comfort in relationships before it brings about clear understanding. This disruption isn't a punishment or a permanent state, nor is it always dramatic, but it does last for a time. It's simply the natural consequence of growing. When deeply held beliefs shift from private thoughts to visible actions, friction naturally arises. Some interpretations suggest this is when wise discernment becomes more crucial than absolute certainty, knowing when to speak up, to stay quiet, and when to move forward without needing others' approval. At this stage, belief isn't loud or flashy. It's deliberate and purposeful. It calls for a maturity that doesn't depend on immediate reassurance. So, let me ask you something that might feel heavy for a while. When your inner transformation began to show outwardly, did you feel an urge to pull back? Or did you quietly accept that some separation from others might be necessary? Because from this moment on, your journey doesn't rely on staying hidden. It hinges entirely on the path you decide to follow. Now, here's the unexpected pushback from within. This is the moment that surprises most people and often catches them off guard. You'd think that once your direction starts to form, things would get easier, simpler, and more settled. But often, the opposite happens. Inner resistance rises. Old habits and patterns make a last attempt to regain control. Not because they're bad or wrong, but because they're familiar, and familiarity is persuasive. Ancient biblical stories quietly show awareness of this dynamic. Right after moments of clarity or first steps of obedience, hesitation often sneaks in, second-guessing, subtle pulls backward. Some scholars interpret this not as failure, but as revelation. When something new emerges, everything, still unfinished or unhealed, surfaces too. Scripture treats this as normal, not surprising. For women in those ancient times, this resistance wasn't just emotional. It held real risks and losses. Choosing to grow meant stepping into uncertainty. You can almost hear the inner dialogue between courage and caution. Is this really worth it? Did I misunderstand? Am I rushing? These questions remain openly unanswered in the text, without judgment. This brings us to a very personal place. Even when we speak softly, resistance often disguises itself as prudence, patience, or realism. Sometimes it truly is those things, but other times it's fear dressed up in sensible words. Scripture never asks us to pretend fear doesn't exist. Instead, it calls us to name it honestly. This honesty carries more weight than we might expect. What stands out is that the biblical story rarely shows divine power forcibly breaking through resistance. Instead, it allows the tension to unfold naturally. Space is given. Time passes. Decisions are revisited. Growth isn't forced. It's chosen, often, again and again. This repetition doesn't weaken faith. It refines it. Here's where steady strength truly matters. Not the bulldozing, relentless kind, but the patient, enduring strength that stays present long enough to understand what's really being resisted. Is it the change itself, or the loss that comes with it? Scripture leaves that question hanging, inviting us to dwell with. Think about this moment carefully. When resistance arises after a flash of clarity, do we rush to conclude something's gone wrong? Or do we pause, linger long enough to uncover what this resistance is actually protecting? Because how you respond here will shape the story unfolding ahead far more than the resistance ever could. This is the invisible formation happening before any outward movement begins. I want to be completely honest. This phase might be the toughest part of the entire journey. By now, the inner shift is undeniable. You've recognized it, you've confronted resistance, and you've stopped pretending everything's unchanged. Yet, on the outside, nothing seems to move. There are no clear signs or affirmations, just a string of ordinary days draped in layered stillness atop awareness. In many biblical accounts, the story slows down significantly at this point. It's as if Scripture invites us to feel the weight of waiting. Careful readers notice that this in-between time is where the real shaping takes place, not in the initial call, nor in the outcome, but in this quiet formation of character, perspective, and dependence. This is the work that simply can't be rushed, or it risks collapsing. Later, joy. For many biblical women, this season remained deeply private. No audience, no encouragement. Their faith wasn't tested in the spotlight. It was refined in solitude. That matters especially within cultures that judged worth through visibility and immediate results. Scripture doesn't romanticize this hiddenness. It acknowledges its presence and its costs. even though these sacrifices go unpraised publicly. This is also the place where control softly slips away. You've done all you can, been honest, present, and yet the outcomes stubbornly refuse to align with your timetable. Prayer here becomes less about petitions and more about endurance. Fewer words, more being. Sometimes it's hard to know what to pray at all. Only a quiet commitment to remain. What troubles many is that this hidden work hardly ever feels productive. You can't measure it. You can't easily explain it. To the outside eye, it looks like stagnation, but Scripture often suggests the opposite. This is precisely when roots grow deep enough to hold strong whatever follows. Without that depth, any later visibility would crumble. Here's the quiet twist. Many step away at this exact juncture, not because they lack faith, but because waiting without visible signs starts to feel pointless. Scripture never mocks this choice. It simply contrasts it with what perseverance brings. Staying doesn't make anyone superior. It only prepares them for what's coming. Let me ask you something and leave it open for reflection. When your inner growth remains hidden longer than you hoped, do you decide it has stopped, or do you consider it might be unfolding in depths beyond your current vision? Think about that ordinary day when direction quietly replaces confusion. Many expect this turning point to be explosive, yet it rarely is. There's no dramatic announcement, no sudden emotional spike, no clear line dividing past from future. The day appears entirely routine. You wake up, tend to your responsibilities, move through familiar spaces. But beneath the surface, direction gently takes root, not full certainty, but enough to replace confusion. And that subtle distinction carries more significance than it first reveals. The biblical accounts portray this pivot with remarkable restraint. After long periods of waiting, resistance, and unseen preparation, the text doesn't rush into celebration. Instead, it highlights small yet decisive actions, a step taken, a word spoken, a choice made that cannot be undone. Careful readers sense how Scripture treats these moments as irreversible, not because they're loud or dramatic, but because they're genuine and authentic. For women in those biblical times, such turning points held lasting weight. Embracing direction didn't instantly make daily life easier, but it made things clearer. The uncertainty didn't vanish completely, yet the path narrowed. Strangely, this narrowing often brought relief. Fewer competing options, fewer inner battles, less pretending the future was still wide open. What surprises many is that these moments don't feel triumphant. Instead, they feel calm, almost understated, like something settling rather than bursting free. The belief at this stage isn't fueled by emotion, but by alignment. You stop asking, "What should I do next?" and begin asking, "How do I remain faithful to what I now understand?" That subtle shift changes everything. Scripture suggests that obedience here isn't primarily about courage. It's about willing agreement, consenting to move forward without demanding guarantees. It's accepting that clarity often unfolds as you walk the path, not before you take the first step. Though this sounds simple, it calls for greater maturity than any dramatic moment ever required. Alongside this growth, a gentle sorrow quietly surfaces, seldom named. Because choosing direction means letting go of other possible futures, paths that once brought comfort now close. Scripture never denies this loss. It shows its say. Characters continuing on while still carrying that sorrow. Growth doesn't erase grief. It learns to hold it alongside hope. So I leave you with this question, without an immediate answer. When direction finally replaces confusion, do you notice the quiet peace that arrives? Or do you miss the earlier comfort of keeping every possibility alive? When that change becomes visible, it's not always welcomed, yet it is real and transformative. This is often the moment where expectation clashes with reality in surprising ways. After all the private effort and transformation, you'd think that outward change would be met with a relief, encouragement, maybe even celebration. Yet, Scripture paints a different picture. When transformation becomes visible, it doesn't always feel rewarding. Sometimes, it feels like stepping into the light, suddenly exposed and vulnerable, as others notice the change but don't quite know how to react. Biblical accounts reveal that being seen brings new tension. What was once a personal, internal journey now becomes something relational. People start responding to who you are becoming, not just who you were. And their reactions aren't always positive. In ancient communities, breaking away from familiar ways could feel threatening. Even positive growth might be misinterpreted as rebellion or pride. Scripture never suggests this phase is simple or easy. For many women in the Bible, this period came with social consequences. Once their change was visible, it couldn't be quietly undone. Expectations shifted, assumptions took root, and sometimes support disappeared. What stands out is how little these women defend themselves. They don't waste energy explaining or justifying their change. Instead, they simply keep moving forward. Not because they don't care, but because clarity has replaced the need for others' approval. Here's a tough truth. Outward affirmation often lags far behind inner obedience. You can be deeply aligned with your calling and yet be misunderstood. Faithfulness isn't proven by widespread agreement, but by how you handle opposition. Scripture embraces this reality. It doesn't promise universal acceptance as proof of dedication. Instead, it points to something more enduring, the ability to persevere without bitterness. There's also a subtle temptation to soften your transformation so others feel comfortable, to water down conviction for the sake of peace. Scripture treats this as a natural human struggle, not as evil. Yet, it also shows that giving in here clouds your chosen direction. Growth halts not because opposition wins, but because commitment falters. What holds people steady through this isn't fiery passion. It's a rooted understanding. This is where I'm meant to stand, even if the ground feels shaky. Scripture suggests this steadiness comes not from promises of success, but from sincere conviction about the path ahead. You're no longer trying to prove anything. You're simply remaining faithful to what you've embraced. So, I leave you with this question. When your growth becomes evident and others respond in varied ways, do you measure success by how you're received or by how true you stay to what you've discovered? The final steps of this journey depend on which you choose to protect. It's the quiet steadiness that no longer needs to prove itself. Something subtle unfolds here, easily missed if you're still waiting for grand fireworks. Once the change becomes visible and reactions settle, a release takes place, not freedom from all challenges, but freedom from the need to perform or justify yourself. You stop rehearsing defenses in your mind. The energy previously spent protecting yourself now flows naturally into living in true alignment. Biblical stories often portray this phase without commentary. The women keep going, making choices, showing up, without the text ever declaring, now they felt confident. Instead, confidence reveals itself through restraint, the economy of words, decisions made without seeking approval. Some interpretations view this as belief evolving into steadiness, a calm groundedness, less reactive, more anchored. For women in those scriptural contexts, such steadiness was revolutionary. In cultures demanding explanations for every step, quiet confidence became powerful. Not silence born of fear, but silence born of clarity. When you deeply understand your own path, explaining yourself becomes unnecessary. Scripture never presents this as detachment from others, but rather as deeper connection to purpose. There's a tangible quality to this season. Shoulders relax. Breathing slows. Reactions soften. Emotions remain present, yet no longer dictate your course. Criticism arrives, but doesn't settle in. Praise comes, but doesn't inflate. Belief at this stage isn't distant, it's balanced. And this balance reshapes how you move through ordinary life. Remarkably, influence often grows quietly during this time, not from increased effort, but from deepened consistency. Scripture suggests that impact expands wherever integrity holds firm over time. No shortcuts, no forced urgency, simply faithful presence. This kind of belief doesn't announce itself, it accumulates. Still, vulnerability stays. Letting go of the need to prove also means surrendering control over how you're seen. You can't manage every impression, only remain faithful. Scripture offers no promise of ease here, but points towards sustainability. You can endure this path, then. So here's the unresolved question. When the urge to explain or defend yourself fades, does that feel like peace or exposure? The final step in this journey isn't about doing more. It emerges from releasing control over how your story is perceived. It's the space where the old no longer fits and the new hasn't fully arrived. This season feels quietly disorienting. After all that's transpired, you're no longer who you once were. That much is certain. Yet your future hasn't fully taken shape. You stand between worlds. Too changed to go back. Too soon to feel firmly settled. Scripture never rushes through the tension of transformation. Instead, it allows people to live in that space, to move through it, to wrestle with it, sometimes for longer than we might want. It often presents this period as a threshold, a crossing point where the past loosens its hold, yet the future remains unclear. For many women in the biblical narratives, this meant navigating everyday life without a sharp, clear map, no exact plan, no guarantees of ease, only the growing sense that familiar ways felt strange and insufficient. The hardest part is resisting the urge to force closure, to prematurely define everything, or to cling to something familiar just to escape the discomfort of uncertainty. Scripture gently warns against this, not with direct orders, but through examples spanning time, showing that rushing decisions out of discomfort rarely leads to wisdom. In this way, patience during this uncertain phase isn't passivity, it's a form of protection. There is also a quiet sadness present, a soft sorrow rather than loud grief, the ache of fully letting go. Letting go of old patterns, previous understandings of oneself, roles assigned by others. Even when growth is necessary and right, loss still stings. Scripture acknowledges this truth, allowing hope and sorrow to coexist without demanding that one erase the other. Spiritually, this is the moment where trust either strengthens or falters, not trust in specific outcomes, but trust in presence itself. Some interpretations suggest that here belief shifts from demanding answers to embracing companionship, moving forward without clear vision, yet never truly alone. This shift changes how uncertainty feels. It remains uncomfortable, but no longer hollow. And here is a quiet truth, rarely voiced. This in-between season often lasts longer than expected. Not because something has failed, but because true integration takes time. Becoming who you are meant to be requires time. Scripture never hurries this process, even when we wish it would. It approaches the work of becoming as sacred. So, consider this question gently. When you are no longer who you once were, but not yet who you are becoming, do you rush the process, or do you allow yourself to live faithfully? In the in-between, the transformation that ceases to feel new, instead simply feels true. This season is rarely discussed, perhaps because it lacks drama. no urgency, no excitement, no grand sense of arrival. The change that once felt delicate, disruptive, even risky now feels ordinary, woven into daily life. It no longer dominates your thoughts. Instead, you live from it. And that quiet normalcy is the true goal. Biblical stories often end accounts of personal transformation without grand finales. The women simply carry on. They work, they relate, they make decisions, and they persevere from this new center. Scripture does not highlight this phase with signs and wonders because the real work happened before. What remains is faithfulness over time, consistency when no one is watching, and alignment that requires no announcement. In biblical times, the transformation women experienced was powerful precisely because it was enduring. Their lives might not have become easier, but they grew steadier, less shaken by changing expectations. Scripture paints wisdom not as flashy announcements, but as a grounded presence, a woman who understands her role, even when circumstances shift around her. What's fascinating is how temptation changes during this journey. It's no longer about fear or brute resistance. Instead, it creeps in through gradual drifting, small compromises, and a slow forgetting of the lessons learned along the way. Because life feels manageable once again. Scripture doesn't condemn harshly but offers gentle reminders. Stay alert, stay grounded. Maintaining this growth is just as important as reaching it. Here, there's also a subtle kind of freedom, hard to put into words. It's not freedom from challenge, but freedom from constant inner struggle. Your identity no longer feels like a daily debate. Decisions become more natural because they're filtered through a clearer understanding. Belief isn't dramatic or emotional here. It's lived out quietly, revealed in tone, patience, boundaries, and endurance. This is where the entire process shows its true purpose, not in a single spectacular moment nor a grand breakthrough, but in a person, shaped progressively over time. Scripture cares less about what you've left behind and more about who you've become. The transformation wasn't meant to impress others, but to anchor you for whatever lies ahead. So, I leave you with this question. When your transformation settles into something steady and real, do you take a moment to recognize how far you've come, or do you simply keep moving forward without glancing back? What this journey quietly reveals is that spiritual transformation is seldom loud, fast, or obvious. Instead, it unfolds in ordinary moments, through small acts of faithful choice, and in the stillness that teaches more than easy answers ever could. Scripture doesn't portray transformation as a single event. Rather, it's a long, steady obedience that reshapes how you see yourself, relate to others, and walk with God. Perhaps the deepest question isn't whether change happens, but whether we learn to recognize it while it's still quietly forming beneath the surface. If this reflection resonates with your story, I'd love to hear which season feels most familiar to you right now. Share a word, a phrase, or even a question in the comments. And if these thoughts brought new light to your path, consider subscribing so you won't miss what's coming next. In the following reflection, we'll explore what happens once change has settled, when belief faces not uncertainty, but the quiet demands of daily faithfulness. That part may challenge you more than you expect.